What's going on, guys? It is week 2 of our Great Expectations series. Last week I talked to you guys about the expectations that we put on ourselves, and then this week we are going to talk about the expectations that others put on us. And again, this applies to everybody in every situation. There is expectations, even whether you realize it or not. There's expectations on you from other people, whether you are in a full-time job, whether you are in full-time school, whether you are staying at home and doing nothing. It doesn't matter where you are or what you are doing, there's always some type of expectations on you from other people. Whether that's sports, whether that is your job, whether that is your future, maybe it's your parents. Maybe your siblings are successful at something and others are expecting you to do the same thing. There is always expectations from other people. Maybe you don't like these expectations because they are extremely hard to live up to, or maybe you don't like them because it's something that you don't even want to live up to. So I want to talk to you guys about an experience that I've had in the past. This one is kind of heartfelt to me, a little bit of passion there. I mentioned to you guys that I wrestled in the last video. And there's one thing about wrestling, and that it is an extremely mental sport. It is arguably, I would say that it is more mental than it is actually physically. And another thing is that wrestling in practice and wrestling in an actual match are two completely different worlds. Like, I'm talking about completely different. This applies for every sport, but I think that this is more apparent in wrestling than anything else. Even if you're going live, and what that means is that you wrestle one of your teammates in practice for real. Like, you guys are actually going at it, you're actually wrestling each other. Even doing that compared to an actual match is completely different. It's nothing the same. And so if you guys ever have the opportunity, or have had the opportunity in the past, to watch a first-time wrestler wrestle their first match, or even their 10th match, it really takes a long time for you to translate what you do in practice to what you do in a match. So if you ever have the opportunity to watch a new wrestler, their coaches have been teaching them the fundamentals. They're learning how to actually wrestle. They're learning how to do takedowns. They're learning how to defend stuff. They're learning all these different things. And they walk into the match, they put their foot on the line, shake the hand, the whistle blows, and you can just see it. Everything that they've learned, everything that their coach is telling them absolutely disappears from their mind. They're not focused on anything anymore. Everything just, it's like a blackout almost. You can't even hear other people. You just go silent, and the goal is to pick up the other person and slam them on the mat as hard as you can. And there's a common misconception that is what wrestling is about. That is Olympic wrestling, where they do suplexes. High school wrestling, really, you're not even supposed to. You can kind of pick them up, but you cannot suplex people. Really, you don't, nobody does it at all, really. So it's not a part of high school wrestling. But that is what a new wrestler wants to do. They try to pick the other person up, slam them as hard as they can. And I don't know if you guys have ever tried to pick somebody up when they don't want you to, and they're trying not to let you put them up. All they have to do is shift their weight. It's really hard. So a lot of the times they're not even able to pick them up. So what they resort to is they start slinging. They grab around the waist and they start going in circles, and it's just chaotic. And I mean, it's brutal. It's a crazy experience. If you ever get to watch that, I recommend that you go do it. It's I want to say funny. It's also a little bit sad, but it definitely is funny in a sense. But that was me. Not in a sense that I was trying to sling a lot of people down, but for the longest time, I could not translate what I was learning in practice to what I was doing in a match. So I was a pretty good wrestler in practice, and the only reason that I tell you guys that is not to sound prideful or anything like that, but the reason I tell you guys that is because I absolutely sucked in actual matches. I mean, I was terrible. I probably lost more matches than I won. And the reason that was because I was so in my head. It's such a mental sport, and I was so in my head about things that I just, for the life of me, could not translate what I was doing in practice or in practices. And so my coaches and my teammates would see the way that I would wrestle in practice. I was a completely different wrestler. At least every other day, my coach would sit me down and he would say, if you wrestle in a match like you wrestle in practice, you will win state. You will be a great wrestler if you just wrestle the way you do in practice. And I know that he meant good by it. I know that my teammates meant good by it when they would say similar things to me. But it didn't help. It did not. It honestly made things worse. I was so in my head about things. Now that I knew that my coach was expecting this of me, I would walk into a match with everything that I was telling myself, everything that my dad was telling me, everything that my coaches were telling me, everything that my teammates were telling me. And that's all I was focused on. And I couldn't actually wrestle. And there was no room in my head for me to actually recall what I was doing in practice. And it was absolutely brutal. So that was me for the longest time. And the only when I was able to stop focusing on what others were expecting of me and what I was expecting of myself and just wrestle, only then was I able to actually begin to translate over and see success and see change in the way that I wrestled. So when I was brainstorming for this, knowing that it's just annoying, like going back to that, the whole wrestling thing, just dealing with the anxiety and the stress that produced, knowing that I would have to walk into a match, knowing that I most likely was going to lose and not wrestle the way that I practiced the day before, dealing with that was the most annoying thing ever. And I could imagine how that would look in a full-time job. I could imagine how that could look in your family. It's honestly brutal and destructive in every situation. There really is no good that comes from that. So when I was brainstorming, there's a story from the Bible that kind of popped in my head, and that story is of King David. And everybody knows King David. You've heard the story of him killing Goliath. You've heard the story of just of him, how good of a king he was. He was a man after God's heart. We all know King David, but if you've never read how David was picked to be the king, it will absolutely surprise you. So basically what went down is that Israel at the time had a king named King Saul. So King Saul was listening to everything that the Lord was telling him. So as you can imagine, they were doing good. They were successful. They were winning these battles because Saul was in accordance with what God was telling him, and he was being obedient. Now Saul, after some years, began to be confident in himself, and he developed a little bit of pride, and he no longer was being obedient to what God was telling him, but he was being obedient to what he was telling himself. So God had spoken to this dude named Samuel, and Samuel was basically this guy who was a biblical judge in the nation of Israel. He would deal with private advice for people. People would bring their problems to him, and he would give biblical advice, and he would biblically judge and just tell them what they should do, what they're doing wrong, different stuff like that. So Samuel was on locks with his relationship with God, okay? So God tells Samuel everything that's going on with Saul, that Saul's being disobedient, he's not listening. So Samuel approaches Saul and confronts him and tells him that he's being disobedient. Samuel eventually tells Saul that because he rejected what the Lord was saying, that the Lord had rejected him from king of Israel. And so what happened after that is that Saul went away, and Saul and Samuel never saw each other from then. And Samuel, we see at the beginning of chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, that Samuel was weeping over Saul and everything that had happened. Now remember that Saul is still king at this time, but Samuel is weeping, and the Lord talks to Samuel, and he says, "Why are you still weeping?" Samuel had been weeping over Saul for some time, and the Lord appears to him and says, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being the king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." So God tells Samuel that he has provided a future king for Israel and that he needs to go to Bethlehem to this dude named Jesse. You saw the word that I just struggled to pronounce. Jesse in Bethlehem. God told Samuel that he needs to go to Jesse to Bethlehem and that one of his sons is going to be anointed by Samuel and is going to be picked to be the future king of Israel. So Samuel does this. He listens. He goes to Bethlehem and he goes to Jesse. And Jesse lines up all of his sons in front of Samuel. And Samuel begins to go through each and every one of Jesse's sons, Samuel begins to go through each and every one of Jesse's sons and he evaluates him. And he goes through, and you got to think too, Jesse's sons that he has lined out in front of Samuel are beasts. Like, they are ripped. They're seen as mighty. Like, when you picture a mighty king, these are the guys that you are picturing inside of your head. So Samuel begins to go through every single one of them, and every single one of them, he says, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." So he goes through all 7 brothers, and he says, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." So as you can imagine, Samuel is probably confused. He's gone through all of his sons, and none of them are picked to be the future king of Israel. So he tells Jesse, or he asks him, and he says, "Are these all of your sons?" And and Jesse says, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." And he sent and brought him. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." So the youngest of Jesse's son that Jesse did not even bring in front of Samuel was picked by God to be the future king of Israel. And some things that you need to know about David is that David would have been wearing the inferior clothes. He would have been wearing the hand-me-downs. He was the youngest. He would have been the youngest, so that would have been a topic of controversy. He would have been of super small stature. Like, he was estimated when he was to be around 4'10", somewhere like that. So he was of small stature. When you think of a king, of a mighty king, future king that God has picked, let's be honest, you probably would have not have thought of this dude. So we see the expectations that Jesse had over David, that his brothers had, that David's brothers had over David. But we also see that the expectations from his dad and from his brothers had no comparison over the expectations that God had over David's life. So his like, again, I just can't explain how crazy this is, that Samuel goes and Jesse doesn't even bring David in front of Samuel, yet he is picked to be the future king of Israel. How cool is that? Like, Jesse and his brothers never expected David to amount to anything. The only thing they ever expected from him was to tend to the sheep in the field. And we all know what went on to happen. We all know the stories. We all know that he went on to kill Goliath. We all know that he went on to be a man after God's heart. We know that he went on to be a super good king. Like, he was a beast. But imagine how easy it would have been for David to have taken to heart and taken what his dad and what his brothers were telling him, and what they were telling each other, and what they were expecting of David. Imagine how easy it would have been for David to just have been like, "Nah, like, this isn't for me. I can't do this. My brothers don't even expect me to my brothers and my dad don't even expect me to do anything more than tend to the sheep. How is it supposed to be me? Like, my dad didn't even put me in front of Samuel. He has no faith in me. he would have had, if he had to have picked what son, I would have been the last one. How is it me? And imagine how easy it would have been for him to play the comparison game and compare himself to his brothers. Like, my brothers are seen as mighty in front of everybody. Nobody thinks that I'm mighty. All my brothers are ripped. They're seen mighty in front of everybody else. How is it me? But what I want to leave you guys off with is what we might see as flaws, God sees as an opportunity to display his power. David eventually would have had to realize that what made him a man after God's heart, what made him a mighty king, was not his stature, was not his outward appearance, but it was three things. It was his obedience, it was his constant state of running back to the Father, and we see that when he messes up with Bathsheba and he gets her pregnant and has her husband killed, one of his best men. Like, how brutal is that? That is such a rough situation. Yet David runs back to the Father. So obedience, his constant state of running back to the Father when he messes up, because we all do. And then the ability to remain faithful to the calling that God had put over his life. Only when we stop focusing on the expectations of others are we going to begin to see change in our life. There's a few verses that I wanted to point out for you guys. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 6 and 7, it says this: "When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, 'Surely the Lord's anointed is before him.'" So this is one of David's brothers, one of his brothers that is ripped, one of his brothers that is tall. And even Samuel says, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him." Now watch this. "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." That's what I want to leave you guys off with, is only when we stop focusing on the expectations that we have over ourselves and over the expectations that others have over us, and remain faithful to the calling and to the provision that God has spoken over our lives, are we going to begin to see the chains break over our lives and change happen. Because you have to remember, going back to this verse, the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance. So the expectations that others have of us and the expectations that we have on ourselves do not compare to the way that God has expectations for our lives. And that is what I'm going to talk to you guys about next week for the final teaching of the month of what God expects from us.